You can tilt that one down. See your fingers sticking in front of it. You have fingers. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're at in the universe. I'm sure it's morning somewhere. Just so you'll know, if you see me gesturing with my left hand and not my right hand, it's because I slipped yesterday and last night hurt my arm, so it's sprained a little bit. So can everyone hear me? Raise your hand if you hear. Okay, good. Thank you. So Rumi can't hear me? You hear me, Rumi? Oh, good. Okay. So the title of this morning's Dharma talk is Sangha Changes. So community, or the Buddhist community, is called the Sangha. For centuries has been called that. It is one of the three jewels. The Buddha is the jewel of the teacher. The Dharma is the jewel of the teaching. And the Sangha is the community. The jewel, many jewels there. One jewel and many jewels. So it's the idea of jewel is that it's valuable. It's a way of talking about it. And when I say Sangha changes, I'm saying it in a couple of different ways. One is that it has changed tremendously from the time this word or this idea of a Buddhist community first came about, which, as far as we know, is 2,500 years ago or thereabouts. The history of that is not particularly watertight, airtight, dirt tight, fire tight. Any kind of tightness is not particularly happening there, but we don't need it. We can actually look at the community that we have here and get a pretty good idea of how that may work. As a Sangha in the past, and I'm not a historian, so I can't speak specifically, but I'm saying Sangha in the past, whether it's 40 some years ago when I first entered this kind of a community, or 2,500 years ago when this kind of community began to arise in various cultures, starting in India. We've gone through a lot of changes. And I'm not going to particularly trace those down for you. That's something you can read in the history of Buddhism, and there are lots of excellent books on that topic. So it's changed a lot. And one of the things that happens, one of the important things that happens is the cultural context within which Buddhism, as it leaves the country that it has been nurtured in, India, and goes to China, to Tibet, and so on, and to Korea, Japan, coming into the West a little over 100 years ago, originally, as an actual form. It wasn't that there weren't Buddhists living here. So it goes through lots of different structures and changes. Then there's the closer kind of Sangha, the ordained Sangha, monks, and in ancient times nuns, which were part of the Buddhist community and the Buddhist teaching structure, learning structure, and so on. And this is done in so many different ways. Excuse me, even today, if you went to and looked at the Sangha in the Thich Nhat Hanh's community, or if you looked at Panlap Rinpoche's community, or for that matter, Trungpa Rinpoche's community from 1970 when he arrived in this country. Quite a bit of contrast in the way that functions. And here we are in this situation, and it's still changing. And Buddhism coming into the West as a teaching of the three marks of existence, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, etc., is going to show up differently because everything is dependently arisen. There is no solid, separate entity anywhere, including the Buddha, including you and your children. Everything that shows up goes away, vanishes, and it's ordinary. It's scary if there's a grasping at something. Then we don't want to let go of that tree limb because it's 30 feet to the ground, you could say. If one is realized, if there is a realization, then there may be a tree limb. There may be falling, but there's no ground. And if you think there is, you're going to suffer and you're going to be frightened off and on. This is why I encourage you not to believe in Buddhism. It's not about belief in anything. It may be more about not believing, not disbelieving, and not ignoring, so that you can see the fundamental truth beyond the relative grasping, rejection, and shutting down. Not easy. Necessary to train one's mind, starting with a very discontinuous grasping and rejection that is happening in the mind all the time, 24/7. Having some difficulty here with my humerus. Is that what it is, technically? So the whole idea of right and wrong is extra. It's not that there aren't some teachings that use the Buddha's Dharma as some kind of a support. That seems to be some kind of a misunderstanding, or at least not a thorough understanding of it. And I'm not here to take issue with anything. There are always going to be people dependently risen. There's always going to be students. There'll be students for everything. I'm sure if you look around the country today, there's followers for anything that shows up that has any kind of shininess to it. And Buddhism is not a particularly, and the Sangha is not particularly, and the teaching is not particularly about togetherness. You have to, in order to have a togetherness, there has to be separations. It's not that there aren't relative separations, but when there's clinging to the relative separations, then there's a need for togetherness, which is to end what? The loneliness. There's plenty of room when I finish the other part of this presentation to respond to questions. So I could go further into that, or we could ask questions about it. But the next aspect or part that I want to talk about is the changes in our community. This community has slowly been coming together as a gathering of people. First within the Vajradhatu, when I first started formally studying Buddhism with first of all with Katagiri Roshi in Minneapolis, and then with Trungpa Rinpoche and his Sangha and students and so on. And so I did my best to stay with that. And Sangha is very important, very important. It may be, of the three jewels, it may be the most important, because without it, nothing happens. Even the Buddha was part of the Sangha. He was a member of the Sangha with no card. In our particular Sangha, which is now, as of the 18th of November, has now been established as the Order of Immediate Light, which has been happening. It's nothing new. It's just that rather than let that kind of wiggle this way and wiggle that way, show up this way and start to go away that way, or be in any kind of form that doesn't have any designation to it, it tends to, without this person protecting this way of teaching, this way of presenting the Buddha's Dharma, this way of understanding the Buddha's Dharma, then it comes in question, because it's part of the, as you know, I'm ordained, and other monks that we have ordained, including the 5 new monks last Wednesday, not that long ago, are practicing within this particular way. Again, right and wrong are extra. Just if this is for you, then we're here. If it's not for you, then go do something else. As they say, kind of romantically, but there's something to it. Follow your heart. You don't have to believe or disbelieve anything. You'll know. You'll know. If you have doubts about it, you might want to look at them for a while before you run across the mountain. But doubts are just an aspect of intelligence. They are not to be believed, disbelieved, nor disregarded. So in our particular situation, as some of you know already, we're the things that we do in as a Soto Zen, part of the Soto Zen order, and also our lineage, and then an extension as the Order of Immediate Light. We don't do things in the same way, the same forms that were done. Say if you went to Tassajara or Green Gulch or some other, or Heiji for that matter, which is mostly about lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of forms. We do emphasize sitting practice of meditation, shikantaza, zazen, however you want to characterize it. Very simple, sit down and observe. Very simple and radical kind of meditation, a minimalist kind of meditation. Not correct as opposed to maximalist or surfacey, or more displayed and more displaying more forms, more complications, more elaborations. Not correct, incorrect. So there's that. And I can respond to more questions or if you have them. But the other thing I wanted to say is this particular Sangha, because of the technology, because of everything from to just being in the West, to the Vidyadhara showing up in the West, and all of the other Tibetan lamas and teachers showing up here. And also Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism, and all the other different forms coming here, and the different interpretations of those forms. And these are all necessary. So some people are not going to study in the way I teach, not interested. As I think Susan Piver told, one person was asking about, what do you think about Sokuzan? And I think she said, well, some people really hate Sokuzan, and then other people really love Sokuzan. And then she said, I happen to love Sokuzan. So this is, I guess, how she checked it out with Susan to see whether I was going to be a charlatan or not, perhaps. So since this community is very, in the sense of, it's old, but in another sense, it's new in terms of the forms are always changing. And I'm not going to go into all three tenets, but the first tenet of this particular order of immediate light is consciousness always finds its own form. And that's something you can explain in a couple of sentences, and something you will never be able to explain. Not two. So the community that's arising, as far as here we are on Zoom. A year ago, there might be a few Zoom situations happening, but usually we would be meeting in the monastery and teaching there. And as some of you know, Bruce, who's on the screen here, Bruce Nelson, old friend of mine, Dharma brother, comes in on Fridays and teaches a class on whatever he wants to teach on Buddhism. So Bruce has also not been able to come in, although he doesn't live too far away, he and his wife, Terry. So they've had to modify this to teach from the Zoom situation. So there's a downside to it. We aren't seeing each other, but the upside is look at all the people we're getting together with here. Countless numbers of people that live not only a few hundred miles away, but around the other side of the earth. So different shape of the whole thing, of the Sangha. And the thing that I emphasize about Sangha was emphasized somewhat in other lineages that I practiced in, or other teaching situations, learning situations, is Sangha is very, very important. Might be the most important of the three jewels. And you have to have all of them, but it's very, very important to work with a community and to interact with your Dharma brother, Dharma sister who's right next to you, studying with the same teacher, the same teaching, and yet your understanding, your connection with that is much, much different. And I emphasize the word different, not better. not more clear, not less clear. And what I say to people who decide to come this direction and ask me to function as their guide, helper, teacher is pay attention to those three jewels. They don't have to, as far as I'm concerned, you never have to receive vows or precepts or become a monk. That's up to you. That's your business, not mine. If you go that way, then I'm here to help you with it. And if you don't need to go that way, as those of you who have asked me about that know that I stop you and say, don't do anything else you have to. If you don't have to do this, why do it? You can still study. So it's up to you how much glue you need. Less glue may be better. More glue may be better. That's your business. And I mean that literally. So maybe we could have some questions about this topic, about Sangha, in any direction you want to go. I would try to.
I had a question about the Sangha now that it's just so different, meeting with everyone virtually, even amongst the practice residents.
Mm-hmm.
Does it require any different type of effort to continue working with the Sangha when it's so easy to stay distant from the Sangha, bowing?
Yes, I would say the simple way to do it, and the old-fashioned way, is just schedule yourself. You decide, possibly with the help of the teacher, but you could also say, I'm going to go to every Wednesday class because it's the Shoba Genzo at noon. I'm going to do that, and every Monday evening book study or something, and then just use the form so that you can get to those classes. And as you've heard me say many times, and I'll say it over and over again, and I'll respond to this if you have questions about it. You do not have to understand what you're studying. This is not a university. Not that it might not be in a couple of years, could be. But you do not have to understand. This is not the conventional way of studying. If it is, then we're talking about who's smarter, who remembers more. We're starting to evaluate and give some kind of a hierarchy to the study situation that is not necessary. It's just a huge misunderstanding about the whole system of education in the West. Big misunderstanding. I'd be happy to respond to any questions you have around that, but you may not like my answer. So what is good? You need to study. You need to, if you're a student, especially if you're a student of mine, you need to study with others, not just your own book. So sometimes people will say, if I say, have you read Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism? This is, oh yeah, I read that. And I says, what are the three lords of materialism? Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Well, didn't read the book then. It's not that you have to remember that, but about all things you would have some idea. You might, even if you remembered one of them, it's in the introduction to that book. So quite often we read books by ourselves, and then we just assume because of the education system and the way we've been trained, we just assume, well, we read that book, check that one off. Whereas coming together with a Sangha and studying that book time after, we've been through Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism countless numbers of times since I began studying that as a group with other people in 1975. I couldn't even tell you what the three lords of materialism are. I couldn't pass a test on it. If you don't understand what that statement is, you should ask questions. Because it's not about information. It looks that way, and it looks that way initially, but fundamentally is not. If it were, then some of you would be doing better than others. Some of you would be better than others. Some of you would be scholars, and some of you would be kind of dull people who probably shouldn't even study the Dharma. You all know what I'm talking about, how we evaluate. Quite often people, it's called weeding out. People self-weed themselves out of studying because they think that the person next to them who is so brilliant and has all these concepts down and who can speak Sanskrit or memorize it. I see the one person grinning there, Chisho, who of course speaks Sanskrit. But Chisho isn't necessarily puffing himself up. I'm this great Sanskrit scholar. He just happens to have studied that. He's from India and he studied that material. But someone else can be intimidated by that because they tend to measure themselves or contrast themselves with others. This happens all over in the Sangha. This is a spiritual community. This is not a sorority or fraternity. It's not that it might not show up in that way somewhat, but it is not evaluation in that relative sense. That doesn't mean you couldn't study this material over and over and over again, which is a good idea. So I guess the other direction I was going to go a little bit was people who aren't particularly intellectual, don't have a good, shall we say, command of concepts and ideas and thinking and logic and all of that, aren't gifted in that area perhaps, or aren't proficient in that area, but are extremely proficient with intuition, their insight into the nature of things through the center of the concepts, without the oars of that particular boat, see very, very clearly. And sometimes if that isn't acknowledged, then this person weeds themselves out and just thinks that, well, I can't understand meditation on emptiness. Or I can't understand the Samdhina Nirmochana Sutra, even with the commentary on it. With the Lankavatara Sutra, also with the commentary, still very difficult to access that material. But we do it anyway. And that's what I'm saying. Just do it anyway. And if you do it as a community, and if you do it consistently and persistently, and what's that other word? Repetitively, eventually that which is necessary for you to understand so you can liberate yourself from this insane, crazy six realms, human realm, before your body-mind complex goes back into the elements. So that's something that would really support you. And if you wish, you can continue to ask questions, or Chazan, you can rephrase your question so I can answer it more accurately. Was that Chazan? Did you want to know more, Chazan?
I do, if you can hear me. Rumi's having a bit of a morning.
I don't mind. I can hear you. Go ahead.
I actually had a question about that.
Yes.
What is, and this is kind of personal, but we have a child in this Sangha now, and he did not choose to live in this monastery. So what is his relationship to Sangha and is part of that community?
Okay, he's to be included as much as possible with respect to the forms and with respect to people's practice. So we don't go overboard and take him into the zendo when other people are trying to meditate. So you wouldn't do that. On the other hand, if he shows up a little bit now and then with a little bit of racket, it's just a middle way, a little bit, but not too much, a little bit. If that's what you're asking me about. I mean, everybody wants to see him, who lives at the monastery or knows him, but we don't need to overdose on him. That's your job as a parent. You're supposed to overdose on him. Good luck. You already know that. It's a more specific question if you have it.
Cheers, I'm bowing. Just what is the balance between a monastic and a householder?
That's what you're finding out. That's how you got yourself into this mess. I mean, that's what you're finding out. That's your inspiration to be a monk. Showed up many, many years ago. Here you are. And we don't know how we're doing this together. That's why I often say to people, I'm not functioning as your guru. I'm functioning as someone who has more experience, who can help you and help us put this together using the model of the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, the teacher, the teaching, and the community. Using that, and then we need to interface with the community that we're in, Michigan, the West, United States, the whole construct here, and the way society shows up and changes and morphs from this into that and this into that with all of the politics of experience. And so it's important to observe and don't do anything unless you have to. And that way you'll observe it right up to the last second before it's time to do something. As you've heard me say many times, this is just another word for patience. Don't move based on hope and fear. Observe the hope and fear. Do not try to get rid of hope and fear or cover it up with solutions, conclusions, evacuations, exclusions, or any other of those oozins.
Thank you.
Teresa, go ahead.
Teresa bowing. Sometimes in book study, I can understand a little bit intuitively, like you mentioned, but I get really afraid to form a question or make a statement. How might I work with that, Ellen?
Less is better. Just receive. You heard me talk about receiving and producing. Don't produce unless you have to. This means you are watching dependent origination as it shows up in your own personal mind stream. You're no longer necessarily hooked by it, but you're observing it. So if you just produce when you see clearly, that means you've done a whole lot of receiving. This is why I sometimes talk about listen 90% of the time, talk 10. Unless you're me and I get to talk whenever I want to. But if you're functioning as a student, then be a student. I also function as a student. It just may not look like it. But just receive. If you're really receiving clearly, then you can produce out of that extreme clarity of no self, no other. It's a direct perception that is called, in the Yoga Chara tradition, is called, I don't know, what's it called, Shisho? Can't remember what that is. So everything is perception only or consciousness only, or it shows up as subject object. And this is what we get hooked by, that is fueled by the hope for something better and the fear of something worse. And if you try to cover those up or do some kind of approach, that's spiritual materialism or political materialism, material materialism, psychological materialism. Don't grasp, don't reject, and don't ignore. Simply put, and extremely difficult to function in that way because of the self-centered, the hidden agenda behind the screen. And the Wizard of Oz is trying to pull the levers and push the buttons and control the rolling hills. It's done with awareness, not with a thinking process. We need the thinking process. We need to think. We need to think about the five skandhas. We need to think about the Four Noble Truths and the 12 links. We need to think about that. But those are structures. That's like a boat, as has been the metaphor that's been used in the past, to get us across the river of samsara. But once you've crossed, then you may need to carry boat plans around with you, but you don't need to build boats. Chisho.
Yeah, a little slow this morning, Sokuzan. Vijnapti matrata.
Vijnapti matrata. Thank you. Everybody should write that down.
Sokuzan, Hakaran has a question from the chat box.
Yes, please.
How is the spiritual Sangha different from the greater Sangha of our friends, family, co-workers, and strangers?
It's just a matter of a gap quality. There's a gap between you and your Dharma brothers. There's a gap between, and you know about it. You've told me about it. There's a gap between you and your Dharma brother, your Dharma sisters, between you and your teacher. It's about observing the gap, not closing it. Observe the gap. This is depersonalized. This is called space. And depersonalized, even more than that, there is no name for it. So that's how you do it. You have your father, whom I happen to know, of course, is the distance there is respect that distance. Always respect people's confusion. If you don't respect people, and I'm not saying he's confused, I'm not making a statement. I'm saying, but that gap, if you see the distance between you, the ego mind will turn that into confusion or misunderstanding, or he doesn't know as much as you do, and all of the other soap operas that happen in families. But just observe. If you observe the distance, then you will be able to see the way in which that person is confused, or the way in which they are clear. Which there's not that much difference between the two, unless you separate them. This is why is in the tradition it's sometimes called co-emergent. The wisdom, confusion and wisdom arise together. They're co-emergent. They come out together. It's just a relative way of talking about something that's impossible to describe or explain, justify, validate, or excruciate, which is the other more challenging part of it. Yes, sir.
Earlier, you said that the Sangha, or the community, is not about togetherness.
Yes.
If it's not about togetherness, then what is the community about?
It's about togetherness. Keep coming, my brother.
Sokuzan, what is the togetherness of the Sangha?
The togetherness of the Sangha, if it's understood deeply, is say there isn't anyone else. That's the togetherness. There isn't anyone. Everywhere you look, you see a mirror. You don't actually see the mirror until you see the mirror. Before then, you just see that guy or your dad or your Dharma brother or your girlfriend or the monk sitting next to you. You just see that and continue to practice, and eventually you won't see anything else. The elseness will be gone. It'll still be there. It'll still be manifest. It'll still be shiny. It'll still be dull. It'll still be moving. It'll still be holding still, but it will not be separate any longer. Realize that. It's not a conclusion. It's not an exclusion, and it's not an ending. There is no end. I better watch my words. My son is listening to me too. Further questions, please. The harder, the better.
June bowing. A question on YouTube from Marco in the Netherlands.
Yes, Marco in the Netherlands.
If you feel intimidated by a Sangha member, is it the feeling to look at?
That's pretty good. Yeah, I would say if you feel intimidated, you could, when the feeling arises, it's as Trungpa Rinpoche would say, first thought, best thought. And another way of saying that is just the texture. Just the texture. Don't abandon what arises, the texture, the feeling quality, the almost impersonal sword sticking in your side for who's doing it, or who it's being done to. Adding the personhood or adding the otherhood or any hood to that is extra and tends to cover up. It's a very highly polished form of ignorance, but it will keep you from your true nature for centuries, lifetime after lifetime, by fighting with that, agreeing with that. Don't agree, don't disagree, don't shut down. Very simple algorithm. So yes, I would say what you're saying is the feeling, but that will be more accessible, you could say, or understandable, or have more texture to it the more you practice the sitting practice of meditation and sharpen that which sees and not that necessarily that which thinks. We aren't at a war. We're at war with that which thinks, or the thinking process. Of course, it needs to be included also. It's part of dependent origination. It is not separate at all from Buddha nature. But when it's in the service of ego, then it tries to protect, or tries to justify, or tries to judge, or it tries to explain. The passion area, it goes into explanations and justifications, or even blaming oneself for not being able to feel this appropriately, or not being able to understand what's happening with the intimidation quality that you're describing with that word. So it's always about what? Awareness. Awareness always, consciousness always, seeing always, smelling, all, tasting, touching, all these always find their own form. You can't see what has an odor to it. You can't smell what only has a color. But you can stop avoiding that. And how do you do that? See that you avoid it. Need more help? Go look at the wall. Wall gaze. Look at the wall. Look at nothing occurring. And see all of that stuff that's occurring that just keeps tumbling and tumbling out of the seventh consciousness. Or rather, it's reported that way. It's actually coming from the eighth.
Shiro bowing.
Yes.
The first tenet you mentioned was consciousness always finds its own form. Is there an assumption that we have that's different than that you're trying to address?
I'm not trying to address anything. So, but thank you for that. It's quite the compliment.
Brett Bowie.
Yes, Brett.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the difference between the seventh and the eighth consciousness?
Yes, the eighth consciousness supplies, and the seventh consciousness assumes and rejects and accepts, rejects and validates and invalidates, and just generally fills the place up full of crap. Whereas it just seventh is the eighth is just a supply house. It's just totally impersonal. And you know, the other thing, Brett, is it's just this is a way of talking about it. We just the Yogacharans centuries ago said, well, let's see, consciousness looks like this. Maybe if we divide it up this way, let's see, well, breathing is here and smelling is there. Wait a minute, smelling and breathing are similar. Should we divide it up? No, let's not go that far. I'll tell you what, how about the first five, and then the area that kind of thinks, and then the area that's paranoid, and then the area that where nobody's there, but there's a whole lot of separations going on. And even that completely misses any kind of deep understanding will arise as it is and not as we think it is. It will arise as it is.
June Bowing.
Yes.
Another question from YouTube.
Okay.
Semi in Portland.
How do you spell the name?
SEMI.
Okay. Go ahead. Semi.
If there is no end, why is it important to awaken?
It's not. Do whatever you want to do. It's not important. That being said, you probably know where I'm going to go, or maybe where you're already going is, this is difficult. The Buddha said, the first thing he said was, it's very kind of him to come out and he probably thought a little bit, said, should I go right for the tree trunk or not? Yeah, life is suffering. And then of course, everybody piles on with Buddhism is nihilistic. And so it's not, it's just, he's just looking at what it's like to have a lot of nerve endings where you don't have any control over whether you're jumping in a pile of thumbtacks or a pile of feathers. Same nerve ending. So maybe you're already there way ahead of me. I'm saying because we suffer in this apparent realm that we're in, this human realm of desire, of wanting things to be different than they are. We suffer. It's difficult. So, but there's some kind of identity that is suffering that continues to struggle and thrash around in the pile of thumbtacks, trying to get out of it. And it's difficult. And some people are in a pile of feathers trying to get out of those. So if we train the mind to see what is fundamentally true, things start to slow down. We become less speedy and less grasping about what's happening, and more in the area that I refer to as reception. Receive what's happening. Stop producing your struggle into the thumbtacks, to use a kind of a homely example. But it's like that. It's like we struggle, and we even use the word as if there's some kind of validation for struggling. And so when I say doesn't come to an end, I'm saying that's just a relative statement. Of course it comes to an end. I mean, I think the third noble truth is something about, a bus stop or something. Oh, we're finally here. I think the Sanskrit for bus stop is Naroda. Isn't that true, Chisho?
Just stop. No bus there.
Oh, no, just stop. Okay, just stop. That'd make a great, it would make a great stop sign. Just stop. We could get some vinyl letters and go around and put white letters on the red stop sign, just a word above the word stop everywhere. So just stop doing that. Okay, enough dumb humor. More serious questions.
Bowing. If the five skandhas aren't in one of the six realms, is there suffering?
No, the five skandhas can be anywhere they want to be. Five skandhas, form, feeling, perception, concept, or memory and consciousness, however you want to. They're running around, but they don't get together and hold hands. They don't form a self. They don't form a separate entity. So they're sometimes referred to as self-existing. There's just perception. There's just thinking, but it doesn't latch on to everything else to create some kind of person who can be harmed, or a person who can get ahead or fall behind or become enlightened or continue to remain deluded. Good question. There's a lot of room to go further in that if you would wish to do.
In the line you brought up, life is suffering. What is the Buddha pointing at when he's mentioning life?
But just simply put, just being alive, being an apparent entity, separated into the sense fields and so on. I'm not sure is there some other inquiry or something else you're asking about?
I'm wondering what or where the mistaken identity is in relation to what we think is living.
What do you think? You're pretty smart. What do you think?
You asked a very confusing question.
You asked a very confusing question?
Yes.
So you want a confusing answer?
I want a clear answer.
Okay, then ask a clear question, and we'll make a deal. Ask me take your question and paraphrase your question and give it to me on a shiny silver plate. Speak. There's no prep time here.
Is what looks like living a misunderstanding?
Yes, it is. Thank you. Very good question. Yeah, find out. If you find out, then as it's been said before, the work is done. There's nothing left to do. There's nothing to do. There isn't anything else. Unless you meet people who are suffering, and then you should help them without making things worse for them. Chisho.
How important is the Sangha identity in one's spiritual practice, in one's own practice?
So I think that's going to show up different for everyone, especially in our situation. In ancient times, and it was everything was more, the community was a more simple situation. People got together, they ate together, they practiced together, and so now our situation is such that I'm sure you've noticed sometimes some Sangha members you have a really close affinity or communication, and other Sangha members who are equally devoted to the teacher that you're studying under. You just can't. Your communication is just off. This is why it's so powerful, because Sangha actually gives you a cross section of everyone. It's you meet everyone in the Sangha. Sangha members are quite often people you would never be friends with, because they don't support your particular bias, your trip, your interests, or your taste in beverages. So I'm being a little silly here, but I'm just saying, you meet people in the Sangha that still have the same connection with the truth that the Buddha taught, and with that particular presentation by that particular teacher, but your connection with them could be more difficult, abrasive, or obstructive. But that's what's so good about it. That's why it's so powerful. And I know I spent many, many years making myself stay in the Sangha that I did not particularly care for. It was very difficult, especially the first, 30 years maybe. Excuse me. Eventually that just kind of faded off. But it was very difficult to be with people that you and worked with that were seem to be insane, and yet they're practicing meditation. They've done lots of solitary retreats, and you can't just, no matter how sincere you are, all that comes back to you is garbage. If you have not experienced this yet, then practice a while longer. Pardon me. I'm not saying everyone is going to experience that. I'm just saying if it's a Dharma brother or a Dharma sister or a person, then relate to them as best you can. But you don't have to overdose on somebody. You don't have to, oh, they're a Dharma brother, or they're my, so I have to talk to them. No, you don't. Don't do it. Just be aware of what you're doing. There's no special thing to do other than what I say, train your mind. That may mean you'll talk to me once every 6 months. No right or wrong to it. That may mean you rarely study with the Sangha. That may mean I never see you on Zoom these days or in the monastery. So the right and wrong part is always extra. Everything is dependently arisen, including your opinions, your ideas, your judgments, your evaluations, your hopes and fears, and on and on and on, have no solid perpetrator or no solid personality behind it. It's just coming all over the place, coming from every single direction. So keep it simple. Come set up a forum, train your mind, stay in touch with the teacher, stay in touch with the teaching by studying together, stay in touch with the Sangha by studying together, and just do that. And then whatever shows up, that's it, without any evaluation on top of it or well, this is an issue. Maybe we should do this. Maybe we should do that. It gets. It's not that that you might not want to change and practice in a different way. Of course, maybe, or maybe work with Sangha in a different way. Maybe you should go into retreat for 6 months, or 3 months, or 3 days. Further question about that, or anything?
Kishwai, so is it then the forms that define a Sangha's characteristic or Sangha's identity?
I don't know if you'd call it defining. Maybe you could use that in some way, but I would say the form actually protects the chaos. It's like Trungpa Rinpoche named the center Karma Dzong in Boulder, which is Action Fortress, is one interpretation of that. So the form is like a protection from the complete chaos that is called civilization. I'm not saying civilization isn't valuable or civilized. Of course, we're coming along pretty good, but there's very little mind training. You can meet people who are extremely intelligent, can explain any opinion you have and destroy it just with their logic. They're so smart. But if there's no mind training, it's still circular. Without the mind training, even the greatest politician or worst politician, without the mind training, and when I say mind, I don't mean M-I-N-E. I'm saying train the mind to what? See clearly, not think clearly. That comes with the whole territory. The mind training is being able to understand the thought process, the way in which it manifests as structures within the vastness of consciousness, and sometimes shows up as a person, sometimes shows up as a whole philosophy or a teaching or awakened truth. Very simple thing, very gigantic, expansive, vast, and unmeasurable situation that has an appearance. Rushin.
What does taking refuge mean?
So, to take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha is to take refuge in the Buddha as the example of someone who was not insane. In other words, was no longer at war with anything. The very nature of insanity is just to fight with things. Don't fight with anything. Your worst dragon, your worst tiger, whatever that may, don't fight with it. I mean, you may have to work with it in a way that is different than that. If it's a lot of negative energy or energy that's going to kill you or threaten you. But take refuge in that as the example. And then, and that example won't show up as something you should necessarily follow. Maybe a little bit, but not necessarily. It may take that example to tell you how to live your life in a sincere, uplifted, and genuine way by no longer fighting with your apparent neurosis. Refuge in the teaching is to understand the teaching. You're in a sense, you're taking refuge. You're somewhat socially distancing yourself from civilization or the Western world or the Western way of thinking, at least a little bit. In your case, you have 3 children and a husband and a full-time job, and so it's going to be different for you. That's what I was saying earlier about Sangha. Sangha is going to show up not as some kind of patterning that is acceptable or unacceptable. It's going to show up in a new radical kind of way where we need to work with it as we are, not trying to make somebody live up to being a practitioner this way or that way or this way, or they have to do this, you have to do that. So refuge in the Buddha, refuge in the Dharma is seeing that everything is dependently arisen, beginning to understand that the basic teachings, the provisional teachings of the Buddha, seeing that there's something extremely insightful and intelligent about the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. The 12 links are if you go through those 300 or 400 times, which I have not, I just tell people to do that. You begin to see that things have a connectedness that can be seen literally, and then a unity that is not literal. And it's the same time. It's the same and different. It's this and that at the same time. And then the last one is the Sangha, refuge. Your spiritual companions, Kalyana Mitra, are not only the teaching person who is part of Sangha, but also your Sangha brothers and sisters, and whatever kind of dynamic shows that's your new family. Not that you disown your biological family or your society in your the city commission or anything like that. You might even be a commissioner on the city. I mean, you could still do all of that interaction politically and socially, but there seems to be necessary to have a primary relationship with the mind that can be supported by this particular structure of teacher, teaching, and community. And so what you're doing is you're receiving, observing a vow to do that, and then however one does that is going to be a little different. Some people are all in and eventually become fully ordained monks, and some people just do it a little at a time. The right and wrong is extra, not necessary, especially in our society, which is so extremely complicated, and the communication levels are well, I don't need to say more. They're changing all the time. The technology, eventually you'll just think something and somebody will know what you're thinking, because you'll just automatically download what you're thinking to them, and they'll receive it, and pretty soon we won't even need bodies anymore. Well, you guys already know that's coming. So go ahead, Rasheen.
Is taking refuge in action bowing?
Yeah. You're doing something. It's going to show up different with different people. Sometimes people meet the Buddha's Dharma in a book. Sometimes meet it in a person. Meet it in lots of different dynamics through another person, through another connection. And then you would say, I want to be part of this. I want to emphasize it. I call it glue. So if you do it formally, then it's like you want to make a commitment or a promise, or however you want to say it, a vow to do this. The refuge vow is about yourself and your practice, and the bodhisattva vow is about putting others before yourself, which is very hard. Most of the time spent there is seeing how you can't quite do that. How it shows you how narcissistic you are, because you're always thinking about yourself. So if you receive the bodhisattva vow, then to actually observe that vow is to notice how you can't kind of shake loose the self-aggrandizement that seems to happen with every thought that arises. More?
John bowing?
Yes, Don.
How do I work with, say, a Sangha situation where I'm accepting the situation, but I don't feel that I'm fully receiving the situation.
That's just awareness. There's nothing to correct there, nothing to change. Just notice that you're using two different concepts about the same thing. And it's just about awareness. So you don't have to abandon that for some better solution or better. There's nothing around the corner. Further question is good if you have it.
My concept of accepting is that I'm adding on my own ego of, well, that really annoys me, but I'll just accept it. That way I won't be annoyed anymore. So then I'm receiving. Helping.
Well, I can go back to what you've heard me say many times. I say, don't accept, don't reject, and don't ignore. So accepting is a highly sophisticated form of passion, and rejection is a more subtle form of aggression. Three poisons. So don't do anything with it. Don't accept it. Don't reject it. Don't do anything. Don't ignore it. So you might find if the energy moves towards you, you might need to receive that. In other words, don't slam the door on it, which would be, and also don't encourage it to keep coming. If it moves 3 inches towards you and it stops, then don't necessarily, or if you do, rise to some kind of idea about why is it stopping? Doesn't it like me? Those kinds of things happen. So just watch what moves. The merry-go-round is none of your business, but you can't stop looking. You have to watch the movement, the circular movement of everything. But if you attach by grasping or rejecting, as you've heard me say many times, I don't know if I can get my arm to do this, but it's not about letting go. It's not about letting go. It's about seeing the way you hang on, because that's the key to any kind of deep consciousness work, is to see the claws that you have dug into something rather than trying to pull yourself away from it, because you may be successful, but what you're doing is you're pulling yourself away from the concept about it, and the actual attachment is still 3 or 4 feet underground, and it's where it's buried. So it's necessary to not necessarily come to conclusions about things, nor necessarily settle for a conceptual idea of how attached you are, or how detached you are. Sometimes people will say, well, that used to really bother me, but I just let go of that. Well, yeah, 30 years it's coming back, because if you let go of it conceptually, it might work for a while. It's like a palliative, but it doesn't deal with the fundamental situation, which there is no one that is grasping anything. The grasping may go on. This is why it's so difficult, because the grasping, your difficulty, your negative emotions, your whatever may continue. If you continue to try to get rid of stuff, all it does is reify someone getting rid of stuff, or someone failing or succeeding or whatever. It just builds the self-centeredness. This is why it's necessary to look at the thing itself, the grasping itself, the rejecting itself, and the ignoring itself, and see that there's no one doing that. The stuff is still going to be there. You can't just think of emptiness and get rid of banana peels. Any further questions?
Junshu bowing.
Junshu.
Akaran has a question.
Okay.
Where is meditation included in the 3 jewels? And what are the other tenets of the Order of Immediate Light?
So the other tenets are secret? Well, they're, what's that fancy word? Self-secret. I recommend you contemplate, and I'm going to publish those. I mean, they're already out there. We already read them. I've worked on those for a few years to make them as obscure as possible. And consciousness always finds its own form. And the next one is available, but you could contemplate the first one for a while, and then we can go into the second and third. And as far as awareness practice, it's just the teaching of the Buddha about train your mind, try to see what this is. This is what the Buddha did. He sat down and looked. So it's an awareness practice. So it's everywhere. It's in the Sangha. Those who are training their minds in different ways. It's in the teaching. Train your mind. Sit down, look, see what this is. There's all different forms. There's creation completion practices in the different traditions, the Tibetan traditions and lineages. Excuse me. And there are more radical or simple forms that started, 2,500 years ago. Far as we know, the Buddha just sat down and looked at it. I think he had a glass of milk first. It was a very simple situation, but very radical, a very minimalist, in order to see what is this fundamentally. You get to do that yourself. This is not a belief system, so some of that may show up, but it's about Buddha Dharma, awakened truth. Dharma, truth, awake to the truth of yourself, and contemplate the first tenet for a while.
Thank you, bowing. A question from Nathaniel in Oregon.
Nathaniel in Oregon. Go ahead, Nathaniel.
Is there anything to be done when consciousness streams result in bewilderment and delusions? What happens when those drive actions and communication with those around us?
Well, they propagate and they split off and they divide and conquer, or they divide and fail. So the important thing to do, since you're asking me, then my response would be train your mind. Sit down, unless you're speaking about someone else. But if you're speaking about your own mind stream, then sit down and look at the mind stream. Use whatever teachings seem to resonate with you, whether this person or someone else. But the important thing is to sit down, hold still, and watch the movement of the mind, because that will show you, not right away, maybe not the first month, 3 months, 6 months, it might take years for you to actually, but you have to want to know that. If you just want to settle for some belief system, some idea, some explanation, then that's circular. Not wrong, just circle. Circle is not incorrect, and a straight line is correct. The straight line is just a way of talking about something where nothing happens. So sit and watch the circularity, which you can use that as a delusion. New moon, full moon, new moon, full moon, new moon. Comes up and goes down. It's breathing. Everything is breathing until it doesn't breathe. So just observe it. Do it with your observation. You don't have to listen to me. You don't have to be a student of mine. But my recommendation, since you give me permission to tell you, less is better. Sit down, hold still, hold very still without being rigid. Watch what moves. And whatever is moving, insofar as you can, don't add to it. No production. And if you do produce, then just watch the production without adding anything to the production, like that's wrong, that's right, that should be, that shouldn't be. Takes a while. We can dedicate the merit according to this person. You can do it at the monastery if you would, please. And I'll try to get one of my arms to work here.
This penetrate into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Sokuzan, Shison, Busama, the 10 directions, the 3 worlds, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna, Paramita. O Buddhas and
bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect SokukoJi Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.